Hi, friends. Rick Edwards here. Welcome back to another lesson from the Gospel Project. Today's core passage we're going to be looking at is taken from 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 through 13, and then we skip over to chapter 8, verses 3 through 11. And that's because while both of these passages are about Solomon's building and dedication of the temple, right in the middle in chapter 7, the Bible goes on to describe some other building projects in which Solomon is engaged. But today we're thinking about only the temple and the building of the temple and the dedication of the temple, which we find in chapter 6 and in chapter 8. And then these are just some select verses taken from those two chapters. So, a question I want to suggest that you invite your class to kick around a little bit as you get started is, how do we know if God is present in our lives? How do we know if God is present in our lives? Now, I suspect you're going to get a variety of answers, and I suspect some people are going to say something like, well, I can feel him in my life, and that's appropriate. That's accurate. That's a good answer. But as we're going to see, we hope to go beyond simply having a sense or feeling God's presence. And so we're going to come back to that question, but I think it's a good way to introduce the lesson, thinking about how we know if God is present in our lives, because this story that we're looking at today, this text, is really about the presence of God. So let's break it down. Again, two passages, chapter 6, verses 8 through 13. That passage is about the building of the temple, the building of the temple. So that it goes into a good amount of detail, we're told, about how Solomon goes about building the temple, and it's quite impressive, all that he does, and how ornately he furnishes the temple. It's really very, very, very impressive how Solomon goes about building the temple. And I would point out just some things that I think would be interesting, some things that I think are important to notice about this passage taken from chapter 6. First is the idea of rest. So the building of the temple, finally, remember, they've been in the promised land for hundreds of years now. And the building of the temple finally represents the fact that the people have come to rest in the promised land. So you'll recall, when God is bringing them out of the promised land, when he's bringing them out of Egypt, their Egyptian slavery, even before that, God has promised that one of these days, I'm going to bring you to the promised land. I'm going to bring you out of Egypt, bring you to the promised land, and I'm going to give you rest. But here it is, hundreds of years later, they are in the promised land, but they have not had rest. They've been at war constantly since they got into the promised land. And finally, Solomon, while there are still going to be some things that happen out there, by and large, Solomon has finally brought Israel and the borders of Israel into a place of security so that the nation can rest. And he says that in chapter 5, and then later on he says it one more time. And he makes the point that now that we have reached a point of rest, now that God has given us rest, it's appropriate, it's a time to build the temple. Okay? So that's important to notice about this passage from chapter 6. I would also note that the detail and the amount of gold and the high quality of the materials used to build the temple points to God's worthiness. Solomon clearly believed that nothing was too good for his God. So he spared no expense. The temple, Solomon's temple, was an amazing structure, and it was, so much of it was covered with gold, and the furnishings in it were gold and amazing, just incredible. How Solomon spared no expense to create the finest possible temple for his God. And it points to God's worthiness. And by the way, that makes a pretty good application for us, that we need to bring to God in all of our lives, in all aspects of our individual lives. We should bring our best to God. Not just outward things, but in all of our lives, all parts of our lives, we need to give God our best, because God is worthy. And then I would note, looking at this text again, chapter 6, look at Solomon's confidence. Throughout it, as Solomon is going through this, he demonstrates enormous confidence that this is something he is supposed to do. And he knows this. He has this confidence because God had promised David that Solomon would be the one to build the temple. And so now it is years later, but David has instilled within Solomon this vision for building the temple. So Solomon brings that confidence that this is what God wants me to do. So as he's working, he's doing so with enormous confidence that God is going to bless, God is going to be pleased with this temple. God is going to be pleased with this work. Okay, it's a great passage and lots of interesting, good lessons for us to take away from it. But then let's go down to chapter 8, verses 3 through 11, which is about the placement of the ark. So if the first text from chapter 6 was about the building of the temple, this text is about the placement of the ark. And it is part of the dedication of the temple. So you have the building of the temple up in here, up in chapter 6. You have the dedication of the temple in chapter 8. And the key element, the key piece, or the key event that takes place as part of this dedication, lots of sacrificing taking place, lots of interesting, excuse me, lots of interesting things happening related to the dedication of the temple. But the most important thing was that the Ark of the Covenant had been in a separate location, waiting for the temple. Now that the temple has been completed as part of the dedication, they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant to the temple. And that's what we're looking at in chapter 8. The beautiful thing here is that as the temple, or as the ark gets placed in the temple, the priests who are responsible for carrying it withdraw from the Holy of Holies, this holy place. And when that happens, God's presence is made known visibly through a cloud of smoke. And it was God's way of saying, I am here. And he goes on to promise Solomon, I will be here in answer to your prayer. I will be present among your people, and I will be present in this building. So a couple of things that we would note from this passage in chapter 8 is that the dedication, the presence of God in this now permanent temple, this permanent building, suggests that the time of wandering is done. Now we talk about the wilderness wandering as a 40-year period, and that's correct. The people of God wandered in the wilderness for 40 years while the faithless generation died off. And then a new generation entered the promised land and ultimately conquered it and settled into the promised land. But in a sense, keep this in mind, the tabernacle was a mobile temple. It was designed to represent God's presence among the people, but it was mobile because it was built back at Mount Sinai, and then it was carried with them all through the journey up to the promised land, all through the wilderness wandering after that, until finally they conquer the promised land, they bring the Ark of the Covenant in, but it's still in a temporary location. It's still in a temporary or mobile temple. So now that they've been able to bring the Ark of the Covenant into this permanent building, it's finally as though God is saying, finally, the time of wandering is over. You now have a permanent home, and God essentially says, now I have a permanent home among my people. So that's pretty significant. And what that says ultimately is that God is with us as the people of Israel there. God is saying to Solomon and to the people who are observing this wonderful thing that's taking place, God is saying, I am with you. And that's really what this whole story is about, the presence of God. The story, 1 Kings 6 and 8, this story is about the presence of God among the people. Now, we've created another video called David and Solomon, the purpose and presence of God. It's a contextual video, and I would suggest you take a few moments. It's 10 minutes long or so. Take a few minutes, look at that, because that video will help you understand the big picture of what's going on with both David and Solomon. And I would just point out here that if this event represents and is about the presence of God among the people, if you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, when God promises the Davidic covenant and promises David that he's going to have a lineage, that story is about the purpose of God. This story is about the presence of God. And what we're going to see when you step back and look at the big picture is that Israel, God's people, needs both the presence of God, as we see here, and the purpose of God, as we saw back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So, really rich stuff, good stuff. I would suggest you look at that other video. Finally, I would note, going back to our question, how do we know if God is present in our lives? Well, I would note this. The presence of God can be dramatic or it can be subtle. Now, honestly, folks, for most of us, the presence of God is a rather subtle thing that's happening all the time. As New Testament Christians, the New Testament teaches us that the Spirit of God is living within us. When we give our lives to Christ, when we trust in Jesus, the Spirit of God comes to indwell us mysteriously, wonderfully, miraculously. The Spirit of God comes somehow to indwell us and live inside of us. As believers, the presence of God is in us, always. And God's Spirit is always in us, whether we feel it or not. So while it's great to feel the presence of God, it's better for us to go beyond that to say, I know God is present in my life because he has promised to be present in my life. Now, in this story, God had promised he would be part of the temple. God had promised that Solomon would build the temple. God had promised that he would bless the temple. And then he demonstrated his presence through this smoke, this amazing demonstration of his presence. But folks, it doesn't always work like that. God's presence in our lives is not always dramatic like that. Oftentimes, most often in fact, God's presence in our lives is very, very subtle. And we know it. We know he's there, even though we may not feel it. We know he's present because he has promised that the Spirit, his Spirit, because of Jesus, his Spirit lives within us now and is always present. So the presence of God, this story points to the presence of God, but we need to understand we don't and should not expect the same level of drama in our lives when God's present. Sometimes his presence is dramatic, but not usually. Most of the time, God's presence is subtle, but we can believe it nonetheless. And it's real nonetheless because God has promised his presence would be in us. So it's a very important lesson, very important truth to hammer home with your learners this week. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you next time.